I think a lot of damage has been done, and I think picking up on some of the rhetoric on the press this morning, again, it suggests that for many people, the damage has been done. I mean, of course, just recently, of course, he used the word foe in relation to the EU, and yet he seems to be unwilling to condemn Putin. Now, if you consider also the summit with North Korea in middle of June last month, Trump is appearing to be a leader who seems to be quite comfortable with autocratic leaders around the world, and again, this is something that is being portrayed to people. He seems to be very much of the line where he wants to do individual negotiations with separate countries. He doesn't seem to like the EU collective arrangement of countries, and this is something which traditionally is something which is common with more autocratic protectionist type leaders. So I think there are various characteristics that are.
Well, let me challenge you, if I may, on that. I would suggest to you that any Western leader, and not just the president, any Western leader is happy with autocratic leaders until they're not. For instance, the West courted Pinochet, the West courted Noriega, the West courts currently Al-Sisi. The West seems to have a perfectly good relationship with Erdogan at the moment, until they don't as well. So, dare I say it, Mubarak, until they don't feel comfortable with them for one political reason or another, they're pretty happy with autocrats.
Apart from until they don't is perhaps in reverse, because the US didn't have a particularly good relationship with Putin until maybe Trump's come along. So there's a sort of a reversal. Yeah.
Well, the West was very close to Putin after 9/11, actually, when he held out to George W. Bush, for instance, the offer of great cooperation over a whole host of issues. And then gradually, since 9/11 till now, we've seen this erosion. So I may question, I think the West very conveniently forgets sometimes that it does support, very often backs, very often puts in power autocrats until they decide that they are politically expedient.
We do have, the US does have sanctions on Russia right now. So, you know, that same day, or at least that same week, there were indictments of 12 Russian citizens about the US election. So it is quite unusual, given those circumstances, for Trump to stand alongside Putin in the way that he did.
Yeah. I think the interesting thing about all of that is that the markets tend to, don't actually react until, as you say, there's been a significant shift in the paradigm or a shift in perception. But what we saw in the case of Russia is the only time the currency really reacted was when the sanctions were applied back in April. We had that big devaluation of the ruble. Since then, it hasn't really done that much, even when the indictment came out on the Friday before the summit. So that tells me that the reaction is less about what's going on in the political landscape and more about, one, if further sanctions are going to be enacted in the future. We didn't get a lot of clarity on that. If anything, perhaps a slightly more mitigated tone, which erases the possibility, or it's, at least diminishes the possibility of further sanctions being applied. So that's been a marginal positive for ruble. But the bigger story is what the administration is doing on the trade side.
Yeah, although I think for the ruble, I think, if we look back at the reactions in the US press yesterday, there was a disappointment there. I think from the point of view of Russian bulls, perhaps they were hoping that there would be a much closening of the relationship between Putin and Trump, which perhaps Trump wants, but certainly the circumstances of US politics isn't going to allow right now.
Would you agree that, though, that the direction of travel from the US dollar from here is largely going to be a function of the trade discussions and Fed policy, though? Less to do with the politics?
I think that's exactly the two factors. I think with a cloud of trade wars, I think we've seen a huge flow out of emerging markets back into the US dollar. And why the US dollar? Well, the Fed is the most hawkish G10 central banker, and therefore the dollar is looking more attractive. So I think those two factors by themselves are the main reason why we're seeing dollar strength and the flows out of the EM.
Hey everybody, it's Hadley Gamble from our new CNBC Middle East Bureau in Abu Dhabi. Thanks for stopping by. Now, to watch more, you can try one of the videos that just popped up on your screen. And don't forget to subscribe.